Welcome to the Teacher Leadership Grant Cycle 3 District Practices Fellowship webinar. This webinar is for those interested in applying for and/or learning more about how the grant works. My name is Ruth Ye, and I am the Teacher Mentorship and Leadership Specialist at TEA. I am joined by Ali Friedlander, Director of Teacher Leadership, who will also be narrating throughout this webinar. We hope that after viewing this webinar, participants will be able to describe the goals and purpose of this Teacher Leadership Grant, locate materials, and identify and locate important information. In order to meet our objectives, this webinar will be addressing the following topics around the grant's purpose and goals, requirements, application and review, timelines, and frequently asked questions. You may also refer to the slide numbers to view specific parts of this webinar.
Next, we wanted to dive into some of the grant purpose and goals to ground ourselves in where we're headed with this program. So let's start off with a definition of teacher leadership. York, Barr, and Duke define teacher leadership as the process by which teachers, individually or collectively, influence their colleagues, principals, and other members of the school community to improve teaching and learning practices with the aim of increased student learning and achievement. So with this District Practices Fellowship, we are giving teacher fellows the opportunity to collaborate with other teachers, with stakeholders, to gather information and provide recommendations to district leadership on practices that can improve teaching and ultimately improve student learning. There are a number of ways in which TEA is supporting teacher leadership across the state. On this slide, we have a few examples of these types of teacher leadership. So this grant program is focused on the District Practices Fellowship, which you see highlighted in that first box. We've also got a grant program that supports national board cohorts and also distributed leadership models on campuses. So really with this District Practices Fellowship, teacher fellows provide input and recommendations on high leverage district practices aligned to areas of need. Again, there are many other forms of teacher leadership that the agency supports, and even beyond that, different ways that we see teacher leadership manifest itself in schools and districts across the state, but we just wanted to call out a few examples. And for our theory of action, we know that if we build teacher leader models in which districts select a diverse group of highly effective teachers, train and support these teacher leaders in high leverage district practices and the decision-making process associated with such practices, if they increase opportunities for teachers to meaningfully engage with district leadership on decisions related to high leverage district practices, and implement effective strategies for retaining diverse teacher leaders, then we will see improvements in the quality of district programs and practices impacting teaching and learning and ultimately student outcomes. So the overall idea here is the more engaged teachers are in the decision-making process as it relates to high leverage district practices, the stronger programs, policies, practices we'll see at the district level, which will ultimately impact student outcomes. There are a handful of overarching goals across the teacher leadership programs that we saw on a previous slide. And these are to strengthen leadership pipelines, improve teacher retention, improve instructional practices, and increase opportunities for teachers to shape the profession. You're probably seeing some very obvious links in that last goal of teachers shaping the profession to the overall kind of purpose and direction of this grant. Specifically with leadership pipelines, we're looking to strengthen high quality and diverse leadership pipelines. This could be seen as pipelines into administration, if that's a need in the district, or strengthening pipelines for teacher advancement and providing them opportunities to continue to grow as teachers without leaving the classroom. That brings us to our next goal of teacher retention. So incentivizing highly effective teachers to lead without leaving. So this idea that highly effective teachers see pathways in education, again, whether that's moving into administration or staying in their current role, but these highly effective teachers see pathways long-term to stay in the education profession. The third is instructional practices, looking for teacher leaders to really maximize their impact and reaching as many students as possible, and having teacher leaders weigh in on different programmatic decisions at the district level is certainly a way to maximize their impact on different practices across the district. And lastly, leveraging teacher leaders to help shape district programs and practices. So our hope is that with this grant program, it provides support in building and implementing a fellowship that then districts can sustain long-term, so that these structures that are put into place to engage teacher leaders in the decision-making process are sustained beyond the grant funding years. There are also in the program guidelines, there's a section called Performance and Evaluation Measures that spells out the different type of data that TEA will collect related to these 4 goals. So we strongly encourage districts to take a look at the Performance and Evaluation Measures section of the program guidelines as they're thinking about their overall vision for this program and how they are going to monitor the program's effectiveness over time. So that section might bring a little bit of clarity to some of those initial ideas. And then we also think it will be helpful to districts that decide to apply for this grant program in the development of their application as they're spelling out their goals to ensure alignment across the program. Next, we wanted to provide a high-level overview of the grant. Now that you've got a picture of kind of the purpose and goals of the grant, dive into how the grant actually operates. Earlier, I talked a little bit about teacher leaders providing input on different district programs, policies, and practices. So there are likely no shortage of areas that districts could seek stakeholder input on. We have prioritized and outlined 4 key areas that we are looking for teacher fellows to provide input on at the district level. These 4 areas are human capital systems, support for student readiness to learn, high quality instructional materials and assessments, and student access to high quality instruction. At the bottom of the slide, you see a resource called Teacher Fellowship Areas of Focus with examples. We encourage you to pause the recording now, click on that hyperlink. You can download a PDF version of this presentation and browse some of the fellowship areas of focus that have more details and then examples of areas that fellows could weigh in on. But the idea is here that districts are designing teacher fellowships that are focused on district areas of need. Here's a very high-level snapshot of the sequence of events for this grant program. So first, districts would identify prioritized areas of need as a focus of the fellowship. So this will happen in the development of a grant application should districts decide to apply for this grant. They'll start thinking about different areas of need within the district and how a teacher fellowship could help address those needs. If you read the program guidelines and look at the program-specific assurances, you'll see that this area of focus does not actually need to be finalized until the beginning of the academic year when the grant program is launched, given that the district might have a few prioritized areas and want to take those to the teacher fellows for input on before they select the areas of focus for the year-long fellowship as just a way of investing fellows in the purpose and direction of the program and ensuring it's the right fit. So first, at a high level, districts identify prioritized areas. Next, districts will partner with an approved technical assistance provider. This is a requirement of the grant, and we've got more information in this webinar regarding who those technical assistance partners are and how to partner with them. Over the course of the year, teacher fellows attend 8 knowledge and skill building training sessions. This works out to be roughly monthly, though there is no requirement of those sessions happening every month. But the idea is that knowledge and skill building happens for these teacher fellows throughout the year as a critical piece of this fellowship, right? It's not just pulling teachers together to provide input, but there is training that's happening. Teacher fellows then share the input and recommendations with district leadership based in their research and stakeholder engagement. For instance, they might be going out to conduct focus groups with their peers and surveys of their peers. They might also be getting input from students or families. Teacher fellows then meet with district leaders responsible for decisions related to those areas of focus to provide recommendations and input on these practices, ultimately strengthening these high leverage practices and improving student outcomes. So that's a high level snapshot of kind of what the fellows will be doing and how the program would operate. So now that we've had that high level overview of district areas of need, we wanted to walk through a couple examples of what districts might identify as an area of need and how they would link the fellowship to addressing that area of need. So this first example that we're going to walk through is really a focus on human capital systems. So if you've paused the recording to download that resource called Fellowship Areas of Focus with Examples, you'll see in the human capital systems section, there are various components, right? So we're going to kind of narrow our focus to this idea of systems for educator placement, advancement, compensation, and retention that differentiate based on performance and maximize the impact of the most effective educators. Within that area of human capital systems, you'll see 5 additional district practices called out. So these are effective district practices that in a moment we'll take a look at a district that is looking to improve their practices in these areas. So for example, the first bullet point, right? Using evaluation data to inform district level advancement, compensation, and retention decisions. Ensuring that campus leaders use eval data to inform placement, advancement, and retention. Providing career pathways, utilizing educator compensation systems to recognize and reward high performance, and providing incentives to encourage the most effective educators and student support staff to work in positions that maximize impact on student needs and campus needs. So let's say a district has identified this as a high priority area of need when they're thinking about their human capital systems. On the next slide, we're going to walk through an example of how they can link their fellowship to this area of need. So if that district has identified this area as a focus for their work around human capital systems, they might be interested in developing a local designation system as part of the teacher incentive allotment. So we are going to walk through this scenario, imagining this district is interested in TIA and is in the beginning stages of gathering stakeholder engagement on this topic. So this could be work that the district is engaging in over multiple years before actually launching their designation system, and want to ensure that they are really getting robust stakeholder feedback and think that teacher fellows and this teacher fellowship will fit really nicely with that work that they've identified as a high need. So the teacher fellows in this example will focus on providing recommendations for the district's design of its TIA local designation system. And specifically, there are 3 areas that they're going to provide input and recommendations on. The first is the timeline for qualifying grades and subjects to earn designations. For those of you familiar with the teacher incentive allotment, districts may choose to phase in different grades and subjects over the course of time in terms of teacher eligibility for designations. So they want input on that. Secondly, they want input on the weighting and the types of student growth measures that would be included in their local designation system. What percentage of designations would be based on teacher observation or student growth measures, and what are the types of student growth measures that would be used in the different subject areas. And lastly, they're looking for teacher fellows to weigh in on the plan for how to spend TIA funds on teacher compensation. So let's say, once funding is received, they're starting to think about how they would use those funds and the impact that it would have on the design of their system. Now that we've walked through an example of a district that has identified a need around human capital systems and how they've linked the teacher fellowship to addressing that area of need, we wanted to provide another example, and this one has to do with high quality instructional materials. So looking back at that resource, the fellowship areas of focus with example, that PDF, there is a section high quality instructional materials, or HQIM, in a number of different areas of focus. We will narrow our example to specifically training, tools, and data systems to support adoption and use of HQIM and assessments. In that area, there are a number of effective district practices. You can look on the PDF or read them off this slide, but I encourage you to pause the recording and read through these effective district practices, given this will help with the example we'll walk through in a moment. In this example, a district is exploring the adoption of high quality instructional materials for certain grades and subjects. So the teacher fellows are really going to focus on providing input on the district's plan and process to adopt and use HQIM. Specifically, the fellows will help identify ways in which the district can leverage teacher leaders in the implementation of those instructional materials. So here we're not referring to necessarily the fellows themselves, but they're thinking about how could we leverage teacher leaders beyond this immediate group that we have on campuses to help implement instructional materials. For example, could we use grade level and department chairs strategically to help with the rollout, to invest other teachers in the adoption of these materials, to support them in accessing the materials and understanding the materials. Teacher fellows will also provide recommendations on progress monitoring for the implementation of these materials. So let's pause here, right? After these materials are implemented, the district is thinking through like what would be our indicators of success with the implementation of these materials. Given that teachers have a ton of experience implementing curriculum and many have lived through different adoptions of curriculum, they are well suited to provide input on what indicators of success might be given their lived experience. They're also very well positioned to reach out to peer teachers and gather input on what indicators of success could look like. Finally, prior to making recommendations, teacher fellows will learn about different options for high quality instructional materials, the evidence base for those materials, and engage with diverse stakeholders to gather input on the district's plan and processes for rolling out these materials. So here there is a focus on knowledge building, as we had mentioned on an earlier slide, right? That these 8 training sessions that occur over the course of the year develop teacher leadership skills, but also a knowledge base. They're learning about the area of focus. So this might include really understanding what are the criteria and elements of high quality instructional materials? Why is their use important? How does this fit into kind of the broader district strategic plan? And the better they understand those connections and build that knowledge base, the more aligned their feedback, input, and recommendations will be, and the more effective their kind of research or stakeholder work will be as they're going out to talk to other teachers and other stakeholders about this work and gather their input. That knowledge base will serve very useful. And that we've provided kind of a high-level overview of how the fellowship will operate and walk through a couple of examples, we wanted to share a few district supports that will be available. So the first is an implementation guide. A sample of this was posted with the LOI materials on the TEA Grants Opportunity website. That implementation guide does go beyond some of the baseline requirements of the grant, but it does spell out effective practices for districts implementing this type of fellowship. So we highly encourage districts to take a look at that implementation guide if they are considering applying for this grant and participating in it, given that it could help develop the vision for this fellowship. TEA also administers staff surveys and rubrics to help districts progress monitor. An example of the rubric is also, and I think also, yes, an example of the rubric and the survey is also posted with the LOI materials on the TEA Grants Opportunity page. Again, we encourage districts interested in applying to take a look at those. And finally, in the program guidelines, you will see a table that outlines different opportunities for districts to collaborate with TEA via webinars and check-ins. So that will be part of the support that we provide to districts over the course of the year. And then, of course, through all of this, districts will be working with their approved partners. So we just wanted to call out there are some additional supports that are available in terms of planning for and implementing this program. Before wrapping up this overview section, we did want to call out a couple of additional pieces when thinking about grant requirements and places districts would want to turn to before submitting an application, or probably before beginning to work on an application, to ensure that you're aware of all the different requirements. So this webinar does include a high-level overview of the grant and some of its requirements, but we do really encourage districts to read the entire program guidelines before developing an application. So these program guidelines are posted to the TEA Grants Opportunity website. The program-specific assurances section are included on pages 7 to 9 of the program guidelines, and in my experience working across a number of different grants, when folks ask what is required of me or where can I turn to get a snapshot of all their requirements, those program-specific assurances are always a great starting point and something that I think is helpful in the development of an application or even considering whether or not to apply for a grant. And then something that you'd probably reference throughout grant implementation. Also, as mentioned previously, there are performance and evaluation measures included in the program guidelines that are aligned to those 4 grant goals that we referenced earlier. You can check those out on pages 10 to 11 of the program guidelines. We do encourage you, and I think we'll mention this later, to look at those performance and evaluation measures if you're completing an application, when you're thinking about developing the goals of your grant program and kind of spelling out how you intend to monitor the progress of your grant program.
Now that we've had a chance to go over an overview of the grant, we are now going to talk about eligible applicants and approved partners. Eligible applicants for this grant include LEAs, other than ESCs, and those participating in Pathway 3 of the Cycle 2 Teacher Leadership Grant. This means that districts who participated in Cycle 1 are eligible to apply, but not the districts participating in Pathway 3 of Cycle 2. If a charter network wishes to apply, only one of its charter schools may do so. As mentioned, districts are required to partner with an approved partner who serves as a substantial district support in implementing this grant. Districts may refer to the list of approved technical assistance providers as posted with the LOI and also seen in the screenshots on this slide. Districts or approved partners may reach out to one another before the application due date. We encourage districts to ask the following questions to help determine whether the approved partner is a suitable fit for the district. Once districts have determined a suitable approved partner, we also encourage districts to discuss the topics listed here. These topics cover grant purpose and goals, areas of district need, training scope and sequence, application questions, funding, and important dates. Collectively, these discussion topics serve as a helpful foundation for districts and approved partners to coordinate implementation of the grant. One question that we received was how districts select an approved partner and whether they are able to consult with them while completing the application. As described in this response, districts and approved partners may reach out to one another to explore partnerships. As we'll point out later in this webinar, a list of approved partners will be found posted with the grant documents, so districts may reach out to approved partners that they see from that list. TEA will ask districts to identify their approved partner during the grant negotiation process. Keep in mind that districts and approved partners are ultimately responsible for procuring said partnership and will be asked by TEA to submit an MOU. More information can be found on pages 2 and 7 of the guidelines. The following slides are questions that we received as they relate to teacher fellow trainings and meetings. Firstly, should the district or approved partner design and facilitate teacher fellow training sessions? The expectation here is that since approved partners have demonstrated effectiveness in areas of change management and communication, they will primarily drive the design and delivery of the teacher fellow trainings. As implied by the suggested discussion topics from the earlier slide, districts and their partner are also expected to collaborate to ensure training is aligned to district goals and implemented effectively. The next question here is, what do the 8 skill building training sessions entail? Ultimately, these trainings should help teacher fellows develop content knowledge related to their area of focus and how policy and program decisions are made within the district. A list of questions can be found on page 7 of the program guidelines under TEA program requirements, which provide more clarity around scope and sequence requirements. It is important to note that part of their role and responsibilities includes teacher fellows conducting focus groups with stakeholders. The scope and sequence should address how teacher fellows receive training and supports in conducting those focus groups. If a district and its approved partner wants to modify the teacher fellow training scope and sequence after it has been submitted to TEA, districts must ensure that the modifications meet all grant requirements and submit any changes to TEA. Another question asked if the meetings required for district leaders can coincide with teacher fellow trainings. The answer here is that districts may choose to schedule the quarterly meetings between fellows and district leaders on the same days as training, before or after a full training session. This refers to the program-specific assurances on page 8 of the program guidelines.
As you'll see in the program guidelines, there is a funding cap per school district, charter school, or charter network that is dependent upon its student enrollment. So I'm looking at 2020 to 2021 student enrollment. There are award caps. So if your district is under 25 or was under 25,000 students for that school year, the award cap is $30,000. If it was 25,000 to 50,000, the cap is 45,000, and so on. So this is something that districts should consult in the development of their application because the budget submitted in application part 2, that Excel spreadsheet, and in the budget narrative in application part 1, the PDF document, those budgets should reflect the student enrollments in the 2020 to 2021 school year. And if districts are requesting beyond the permissible cap and do qualify for grant funding, this is something that will be needed, that we will need to address through budget negotiations, and it could slow down the notification process. So we do encourage you to take a look at student enrollment and ensure that your budget is reflective of the funding caps. In the program guidelines, we do outline 3 allowable uses of funds. So the first is approved partnerships. Those costs vary by provider, so we encourage you to discuss this with approved partners as you reach out to them. Again, they do vary by provider and are based on a number of different factors. The second is additional compensation for teacher fellows, so up to $1,500 per fellow. Please be cognizant of this amount. If there's a budget that's submitted with more than $1,500 per teacher fellow, or it's not clear to reviewers how many teacher fellows are going to be included and what the costs are, this will be subject to negotiation, which could slow down the award notification process. So in your budgets, please include how many teacher fellows you anticipate hiring, and then the compensation provided each one, if you will be providing compensation. And the last is supplies and materials, up to $1,000 for this grant. Please include in your budget narrative, if you choose to use money for supplies and materials, how these supplies and materials are necessary and reasonable for carrying out your grant program. We've received a couple of questions around funding and costs, so we wanted to run through some of those. One question was, what is the approximate cost of working with an approved partner for this grant, and how much should we expect to set aside for this partnership? So as mentioned on the previous slide, costs associated with these partnerships do vary, and they're also dependent upon several factors. So we really do encourage districts during the application window when you reach out to some of these partners to discuss potential work together to discuss these costs, discuss your needs, and hopefully that will help bring clarity to the budget that you will submit as part of the grant application. So we do expect those conversations to happen, given that they will inform the budget submitted as part of this grant. So another question we received is whether funds can be used for a contractor to provide the fellow trainings. This would be a contractor other than those provided by the approved partner. So really, if you look at page 12 of the program guideline, the allowable use of funds includes approved partnerships, compensation, and supplies and materials. We reviewed this a few slides ago. The grant really is not intended to fund additional contractors beyond those on the approved partner list. We also received a few questions about teacher fellow compensation. So one was, are teachers compensated for the training? So again, as part of the allowable use of funds, teacher fellows through this grant may be compensated up to $1,500. There's more info on page 12 of the program guidelines. We also received a question about when teacher fellows will receive this compensation, or related to the first question here, how they receive their compensation. That's really up to the discretion of the district. So districts might decide when to pay them out, how to pay them out, if they're paying, per hour or doing one stipend. All of that is really up to the discretion of the district, though we do have that $1,500 cap on the overall compensation per teacher fellow. Somewhat related to funding, we got a question about the number of teacher fellows. So is there a cap on how many teacher fellows may participate in this grant? There is no cap on the amount of teachers that could participate in a district, though we did cap the funding based on student enrollment. So there is this concept of kind of a sliding scale based on district size. We have in the program guidelines, you'll see a table that has the funding cap per district, has student enrollment for the school year 2020 to 2021. And then in the far right column, there's a suggested number of teacher fellows. That is just a suggestion. A district may choose to include fewer teacher fellows or more teacher fellows. That's really up to the district's needs, their context, and I imagine a whole host of other factors. But that is just a suggestion. It really is up to the district. We also received a question of whether or not district grant managers are eligible for a stipend. So the short answer here is no. We do outline in the program guidelines that compensation is limited to, compensation is limited to teacher fellows, following the parameters outlined in the guidelines. The only exception here would be allowable administrative costs in the district's approved budget. So if the district submits a budget for administrative costs, once that is approved, if any of the district grant manager funding comes from those administrative costs, that would be the instance in which it would be permissible.
We will now dive into some information as they relate to the grant application and review processes. All grant information can be found posted on the TEA Grant Opportunities website. A quick Google search will yield a web page that looks like the screenshot seen here. In the application name dropdown, select the Teacher Leadership Cycle 3 for this grant's particular information. Once you navigate to this grant's webpage, you can find all the posted documents under the Application and Support Information section, as seen in the screenshot here. Application Parts 1 and 2 will need to be submitted by the applicant. Application Part 1 contains a number of questions including narrative responses. Pages 3 through 5 encompass responses to questions related to your district's goals, key personnel, progress monitoring and evaluation, and funding. As a reminder, districts can consult their approved partner in developing their application. Ultimately, applications should be written by district staff who will manage the grant. As an additional note, while the budget narrative provides a whole page for space to respond, applicants are not expected to fill the entire page. The remainder of Application Part 1 on pages 6 through 8 include responses about teacher fellows and how they will participate in the grant program, as well as the plan for long-term sustainability. Similar to the budget narrative, the long-term sustainability question provides a page of space, but applicants are not required to fill the entire page for their response. Some application tips we thought were worth calling out include labeling responses and appropriately spacing paragraphs so that our team of reviewers can easily locate and align your responses to questions. Additionally, narrative responses should be unique to your district context rather than a cut and paste of the teacher leader responsibilities. Reviewers will already be familiar with the grant assurances and guidelines prior to reviewing applications. As previously mentioned, for questions that provide one page for a response, applicants are not required to fill the entire page. These other application tips come directly from page 6 of the program guidelines and relate to what materials districts should refer to in developing their application. Districts are encouraged to review the implementation guide, as it is one of the previously mentioned district supports and provides guidance for building and implementing a strong fellowship. For questions about the district's goals and strategies, districts are encouraged to review the purpose of program and performance and evaluation measures section in the program guidelines. Something for applicants to keep in mind is that a team of TEA reviewers will review applications and will use the scoring breakdown provided in these next few slides. Here is the breakdown of possible points for these particular application sections that constitute the standard review criteria. These can also be found within the program guidelines. Continued on this slide are the specific review criteria and their possible points. If earned and available, applicants that receive 70% of the total standard and specific review criteria points seen on the previous slides may be eligible for priority points. The priority point categories are percent of students that are economically disadvantaged and whether a letter of support is submitted for the district's board or teachers. You may refer to the program guidelines for specific requirements for letter submissions. One question that was asked about the application was if a district can submit certain components of the grant application after the application due date of November 19th. The answer is no. Documents, including the optional letters for priority points, are due by November 19th. To ensure a fair and consistent process, TEA will not review or consider any application documents that are received after that deadline. Oral interviews may be used as part of the LOI review period. If used, applicants that receive 70% of the total points from standard and specific review criteria will be invited to participate. TEA will reach out to those districts to schedule interviews if needed. You may refer to pages 14 and 15 of the guidelines for more information. The main point to highlight here is that this is an FYI only, and that no action is required at this time. As seen on page 3 of the guidelines, the following is a high-level snapshot of the LOI timeline. We will highlight upcoming dates at the end of this webinar. Now that we have talked about the various aspects of this grant, we thought it would be helpful to highlight the major grant milestones that will occur throughout the school year. These highlight the main occurrences and are not an exhaustive list of the various parts and requirements for implementing the grant. Tying together what we have talked about in this webinar, there are aspects of coordinating and collaborating with the approved partner throughout the school year, as well as establishing teacher fellows and their training scope and sequence. The last two milestones highlight that teacher fellows must attend all 8 skill building sessions, which, when spread across the school year, are likely to occur on a monthly basis. District leaders must participate in fellowship meetings at least quarterly.
Before closing out, we wanted to address a number of other questions that we have received. So one question we got is around whether or not districts can use grant writers to complete their application. There's a lot of information on the slide, so I would encourage you to pause this recording if you have the same question and read the full text on the slide. But the short answer here is that we don't prohibit the use of grant writers, but we strongly encourage district staff to be very involved in the process if they are using a grant writer, given that these grant managers are ultimately going to be the ones implementing the grant. So should be very aware of what the requirements are and very aware and involved in the development of the grant application to ensure it reflects the district's needs and the vision for the program. I do also want to call out that we do look for unique answers from districts when they are submitting their applications to really reflect the unique context of their district. So please do keep that in mind if you are using grant writers or collaborating with others in the development of an application. Another question we got was around multiple districts partnering together and submitting one grant application. For example, districts that have been working together throughout the TIA development process, that's the teacher incentive allotment, might be interested in developing a similar teacher fellowship and potentially running the training sessions together as a cohort with the quarterly meetings with district leadership held separately. So districts can collaborate on the development of their application and planning for a district practices fellowship. However, shared service agreements are not allowed as part of this grant program, and individual districts must apply. So we will only be granting awards to individual districts, though the idea of collaborating with other districts in the development of or implementation of the grant is permissible so long as all the grant requirements are met. Another question we got was how districts and approved partners could present this grant opportunity to prospective teacher fellows. And I assume here this question might stem from a couple of different places. One is to ensure that there is a demand among teacher fellows for this type of opportunity. The second also, as you probably saw in the priority points section, that if a letter is submitted by teachers in support of this grant program, there are priority points associated with that. So those are a couple of reasons why I think someone could be asking this question. So really districts and approved partners may share aspects of the fellowship, such as program-specific goals and requirements, potential areas of focus, ideas around a scope and sequence perhaps, to really generate interest among teachers. So, even though the scope and sequence for the training sessions doesn't need to be submitted to TEA until the fall, districts and partners might be talking at a high level around what the scope and sequence would look like in the development of their application and talking through the partnership. So high level information like that could be shared with teacher fellows before submitting, prospective teacher fellows rather, before submitting an application. Another question received was how long are teacher fellows required to participate in the grant? As stated in the program guidelines, this is intended to be a 2-year grant. However, extending the grant into school year 23-24 is not guaranteed, and it's dependent upon a number of factors. But let's say the grant is extended for 2 years and a district qualifies to participate in 2 years. The question becomes, do the teacher fellows, the same teacher fellows that participated in year 1 of the grant, need to participate in year 2 of the grant? And the answer here is no. While there are certainly some benefits to working with the same group of teacher fellows over the course of 2 years, there also might be some very valid reasons of why it makes sense to bring in a different group of fellows. And this is really dependent on kind of the district context. So we'd be happy to thought partner with districts that qualify for the grant as they think through this piece, but there is no requirement at this point. Another question received, must fellows be full-time teachers? So the short answer here is no, though they must serve as a teacher of record for at least 50% of the instructional day in school year 2022 to 2023. And the idea here is that this really is a teacher fellowship, so we want to ensure that the folks that are brought on to participate are those that are day in, day out working with students and really understand kind of the realities, opportunities, challenges facing teachers on a day-to-day basis. There is some other information regarding teacher fellow eligibility, their role and responsibilities, and requirements related to recruitment and selection. So for that info, please see page 8 of the program guidelines. Another question we received is, can we use grant funds for substitute coverage to allow fellows to attend trainings and meetings with district leadership during the school day? So the short answer here is no. On page 13 of the program guidelines, a list of unallowable expenses includes employee compensation for individuals other than teacher fellows, with that exception of administrative costs that we talked through earlier. So districts may choose to use another source of funds to cover costs associated with substitute coverage if that's a route that they want to go. Other fellowships that we've seen in action have meetings that happen after the school day as another alternative. So again, those are 2 options that you could use. I'm sure there are others when you're thinking about how and when these meetings will occur.
We thank you for taking the time to watch this webinar. In closing, we have a few key reminders for what is coming up in the LOI timeline. Some upcoming dates to keep in mind include the deadline to submit FAQs on Wednesday, October 20th. Responses to those FAQs will be posted to the previously mentioned TEA Grant Opportunities website on November 2nd, and applications will be due on November 19th. As mentioned, FAQs must be submitted by October 20th. All questions must be submitted in writing to the teacher leadership inbox so that they may be incorporated into the FAQs and provide equal opportunity to all applicants. We thank you for watching this webinar and look forward to receiving your questions.